You are about to listen to the full interview with Jeremy Holden. Sections of it were originally included in our Orang Pendek episode. Jeremy Holden is a photographer and naturalist who has spent his life photographing wildlife in Asia. We learn more about his experience seeing the Orang Pendek and what he is doing now to continue the search. We hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, so I started off as a naturalist as a very small child. I had like a museum in my bedroom at age 4. I've always had a great interest in natural history, and that kind of translated into photography. I started, I think when I was in my teens, I became an amateur wildlife photographer. Then I did a photography course, which then went on to do a degree in photography. So I don't have a biological degree, I have a photography degree. And through that, when I finished university, I continued my travelling. I was travelling before and during university as well to Asia mostly. I continued that, went to Sumatra in 1994 and got involved with the Orang Pendek, which changed my life and kind of gave me the break I needed to follow this as a career.
The Orang Pendek isn't as well known as, say, like Bigfoot or Yeti. Could you give an overview of what the Orang Pendek is for people who've never heard of it before?
Well, we don't actually know for certain what it is. What we do know is that it's an ape, a large ape, whether it's part of the great ape or lesser ape. So whether it's related to orangutan or whether it's related to gibbons, we don't know. But it's it's really, I guess, the Indonesian version of the Bigfoot you have in the United States, except it's a much, much smaller creature. So it's a large-bodied ape, between 1 and 1.5 meters is the usual size reported. It's a biped. It's covered in hair. It's clearly an ape. I don't think it's got any real relation to human beings, any more than orangutan or chimpanzee would have. So yeah, it's a kind of a jungle Sasquatch in a way.
How did you first hear about the Orang Pendek?
Well, I had been interested in this kind of stuff, obviously, since childhood, and I knew about the Yeti and Sasquatch and Almaz in Mongolia. In fact, I knew many of these creatures about the world. It seems almost everywhere has one, but I had never heard of Orang Pendek when I arrived in Sumatra in 1994. And it was while I was there, I met someone who was looking for it. And I remember rather smugly telling them that it was clearly a forest or a myth, a local myth, and that almost every culture had a similar kind of story. I mean, even in England, going back to like the Green Man, you have this notion of people that came or that live in the wild. And that's what I thought Orang Pendek was. But I was wrong.
And this person you met, was it Debbie Martyr? Was she the one looking for the creature initially?
That's right. Well, Debbie she was actually a journalist working on a London. She was the editor of a London paper, and she first heard about Orang Pendek in 1989. Sorry, from a local guide that claimed to have seen one, and I think. The stories weren't exactly new. There's been reports of these since the first British explorers were in Sumatra, like 1780s. But it's something that had really been ignored by the biological community, researchers. But Debbie, I think as a journalist and being very experienced at listening to people telling stories, when she heard this guide tell the story about when he saw the Orang Pendek, she thought, this, to my mind, this man's telling the truth. So she said, okay, if such a thing exists, then show me some evidence. And by absolute luck, they managed to find a footprint. So she initially thought this must be something that's known about. There can't be a new creature like this. I obviously haven't heard about it. So she went back to UK. She spoke to a number of experts. I think she contacted David Attenborough at one point, who knew about the story, and said, yeah, there could well be something in this, but no one was really interested to go and look for it. And people said, if you want to find out about this, then really you need to go there yourself. So she did. She went back in 93, did a bunch of interviews, and she didn't find any physical evidence, but she was fairly convinced by talking to a lot of people that the animal actually existed. So then she took 6 months off in 94 and went back to try and break the story, basically. And if she'd have failed in 94, she probably would have gone back and resumed her work as a journalist. But it was while she was there, I bumped into her, and she reluctantly told me what she was doing there after a few days. I obviously, I realized there was something interesting about her, but eventually told me the story, which, as I said, I was very skeptical about the reality of it. But I hung around, and she invited me along into the forest, and it was during one of those trips that she first saw the animal. And shortly after, I saw it myself, a different animal on a different mountain, but we both got to see it within a very short period of time.
Yeah, I want to get to that story soon, but I am also curious. What do you think it is about the Orang Pendek that prevents the scientific community from taking it seriously?
It's so rarely seen. It's a very, very cryptic. The habitat there is extremely difficult. So it wasn't something that people saw very often, including local people. People know about it, but very few people have seen it, relative to the number of people that go into the forest. So, there just really wasn't that much evidence to follow up. I don't think there was a real disbelief in it, other than in the 1930s, the Dutch, I believe, put a reward on 5,000 guilders, I think it was, for anybody that could come up with any physical evidence of the animal, because there were a number of Dutch planters that claimed to have seen it. And they eventually got, a bunch of plaster cast footprints, all of which turned out to be from sun bear. There was a famous hoax made from a monkey that had had its tail cut off and shaved and its teeth filed down. So I think the scientific community just thought, there's no evidence for this, so clearly it doesn't exist. It's a mistaken identity or just fakery or folklore. So there was a paper written in 1932 by the then director of the Bogor Zoological Museum that pretty much closed the door on any further research. And I think anybody that was researching in Sumatra, not that many people have actually, but I think anybody that was doing that and heard about Orang Pendek would then, when you looked into the history of it, you would come across this paper, which was fairly damning. And I think that was the end of it, really. And there was also a book of the footprints of the mammals of Western Sumatra that had underneath the illustration for bear footprints, it said, any footprints that are claimed to be Orang Pendek are not there, Malay sun bear. It didn't say they'd been confused with this and maybe something exists. It very categorically stated that there was no such thing as Orang Pendek. So I think those things combined, there was not much to follow up, and when you did try and follow it up, you came across these scientific dead ends. So it really shut the door on this.
I know there's a lot of folklore and mythology that surrounds the creature, and I've heard some pretty colorful stories about its behavior and origins. Did you hear any folklore about the creature while you were there that you feel like could actually pertain to a real creature?
Well, no, the interesting thing is that there's almost no folklore about this, which is a really good indicator of it actually being a real animal, in my understanding. The Sumatrans are obsessed with tigers, so there's an awful lot of folklore. You know, the shamans are all, when their spirit animals are always tigers. They have an awful lot of lore about tigers, people changing into tigers, were-tigers, village tigers that look after the well-being of villages, tigers that help people lost in the forest. And I've spoken to these shaman and said, you know, why is there no, or appear to be very little folklore around Orang Pendek? And they said, well, it's just because we don't see it enough. With tigers, this is something that's very much a part of our daily lives. But with Orang Pendek, it's not. We might see it once in a lifetime, and it's something that hasn't really evolved into folklore. So the folklore that does, you do hear there concerning bipedal type animals, it's not referring to Orang Pendek. It's referring often to something that's more akin to Homo floresiensis. So a human type animal that lived in groups, could speak rudimentary speech, but not Orang Pendek. So no, there's not an awful lot of folklore.
Can you tell us in as much detail as possible about your encounter with the Orang Pendek?
Sure. But yeah, it was shortly after Debbie saw her animal on one mountain, and she got immediately sick. So I went back to our house in the town, and she sent me off on what I think was a fool's errand to an area she'd actually been before and found nothing. But I think she just wanted to get rid of me for a few days. So I went up there with I was on a volcano. There was no water in this particular area, so no one was living on the volcano. So we set off about 5 o'clock in the morning to try and get up to the forest as early as we could. And just at the very edge of the forest, the farmers there were growing potatoes. So there was absolutely abutting onto the forest with these dry potato fields with the runnels with potatoes planted in. And as I came walking up quite a steep slope, but I noticed this very, very fresh footprint, which I thought was a human footprint. I called the guide over and said, you know, you told me that nobody lives up here because there's no available water. So how come there's this absolutely fresh footprint? And he said, no, that's Orang Pendek footprint. And the odd thing was, although Debbie had seen the animal, I was with her when she saw it, but I didn't see it. I still had trouble actually believing in it. So I was thinking, you know, no way can this be, you know, we just claim to have seen it on one mountain, we go to another mountain, we find footprints. But we looked around, we found more footprints. They weren't very clear because of the actual substrate of the soil, which was very dry. But we found a lot of potatoes that had been dug up and had been very freshly eaten. So there was no oxidization. They were still absolutely white. But a lot of marks of dentition, which showed some were canine marks, very rounded canines, which later became important. And then we found a line of tracks which were heading directly along the top of the potato run onto the forest. So we followed those. We found at the edge of the forest where something had broken open a banana palm and eaten the pith. Then we found some aroid plants that had been pulled up and the roots had been eaten, and then a ginger which had been broken open and the pith eaten. So this was all in about 10 meters, these four different things, something had very freshly eaten. And as we came up to the edge of the forest, we heard some birds mobbing something. So I knew from, you know, my childhood in England that when birds are behaving in this way, they discovered an eagle or an owl or something that they considered to be a threat. And we heard these two birds, clearly they were mobbing something. And then suddenly there was this enormous rah type sound, which is about only 15 meters from where we were standing. And I turned to the guide and said, you know, what the hell was that? And he began to look very pale and start shaking. I said, was it a bear? He said, no. So while we were trying to work out what to do, I then heard the birds slightly moving away. So it was clear that whatever was there was moving away from us. So I just said to the guide, go in, follow it, go behind it. And I sprinted along the edge of the forest for about 50 meters and then tried to cut off the animal to try and get ahead of it. And almost the moment I entered the forest, I saw about maybe 15 meters away a banana palm sway. I knew something was coming, so I just ducked down into the undergrowth. And probably 7 meters from me, this animal, which was walking very, very fluidly on two legs, it was bipedal, upright, covered in pale yellowish hair, quite short, glossy hair. It was looking backwards towards, obviously trying to listen to my guide that was behind, that had been following it. So its face was turned away from me. So I saw the head, but I didn't get to see the face, which at the time I was very glad not to see the face. So I saw it for just maybe two or 3 seconds, but very, very close. I didn't make any move. I had a camera around my neck. I didn't attempt to make a photograph because I was too close to the animal, and I thought if it hears anything and turns and looks, we're in the kind of range where it might well attack. And the thing was, the name Orang Pendek actually means short person in Malay. So what I was expecting was not something as big as what I actually saw, which was in the region of about 1.5 meters tall. It was also very, very well built. So there was no neck. The head fits very much into the shoulders, which were very, very broad and very. I didn't actually see muscle because of the hair. It's not like a chimpanzee where you see the skin through the hair. The hair was thick, but I could see that this was an extremely well-built animal. Very long, muscular arms as well. So it's something I don't think you would have stood much of a chance against had it have decided to charge. So I kept quiet. I watched it pass. Obviously, I had an absolute carnival of thoughts and emotions going through my mind. You know, what I'd seen, it was extremely shocking. It was a little bit frightening. I was in awe. But I really needed to speak to someone and explain what I'd seen. Whether my guide then turned up and he was motioning that it's gone this way, it's gone this way. And I said, I know, I've just seen it. So then we followed it. And had I have followed it immediately, I probably would have got a very good view, because it went into an area of forest that was quite open, and it would have, down a slope, it traversed that. Had I followed it, I would have been above it and had a very, very clear view. But by the time we arrived, it had gone through. We followed the footprints, a very clear trail of where it had gone. And because this is a volcano, there was, within every few 100 meters, there's these deep gullies, water runoff gullies. They're dry, but they're about 3 meters wide, 3 meters deep. And the animal had got across that because it was vocalizing on the other side and had been mobbed by another bunch of birds. And I looked at the gully and thought it would be difficult for us to cross it, and if we tried, it would have made a lot of noise. So I made the executive decision to go back, tell Debbie what we'd seen, and get her to come the next day in the hope that the animal would still be there, rather than us trying to follow it and scaring it off.
After that encounter, were you convinced that what you saw was the Orang Pendek? Was there any doubt about what you had seen?
Well, the interesting thing about my particular sighting was we started off with a footprint. We found food items that showed very clear dentition. We heard 3 different vocalizations from the animal. So it made the first rah sound it made. There was then 2 more sounds after that, and it continued vocalizing. It made 4 or 5 or so of the same vocalizations as it moved away. there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that this was something new, something unknown. It was a biped. It was walking very, very fluidly, unlike anything else I'd ever seen. I had seen orangutan previously in northern Sumatra walking on the ground, and it's a very, very different way that they actually move. So this animal, clearly a habitual biped, clearly a different colour to anything else. I mean, there's just nothing really to confuse it with. So I don't have any doubt in my mind that what I saw was something that's unknown. Whether it's Orang Pendek, I mean, this is something, it's a name that's given to an animal that people occasionally see in Sumatra. Whether, what is Orang Pendek, we don't really know. If there's one animal there, if there's two animals, three animals, we just alighted on that name. It's what people say. It just means short person in Malay. It's not a specific animal name. And if you go to different areas of Sumatra, they have different names for it. So it's the name we alighted on for this thing.
Did it change your worldview to see another creature walking on two legs like a human does?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's difficult to put into words. I've always been interested in these kind of things. I was always interested in natural history, and I also had a great interest in paleoanthropology. And honestly, my first thoughts when I saw this was that it was Australopithecus. So one of our very, very early ancestors that supposedly evolved on the African savannah. I don't believe that now, but the reason I thought that at the time is because it was just so unlike any other of the great apes. And it's because of the way it walked. It was very, very clearly a biped. So the thing is, also, when you see something that looks like a human being that clearly isn't, that comes with a whole gamut of creepy responses, because it's almost like a monster. It's something, which is why I said I was very happy at the time that I didn't see its face. If I'd have got to see that creature upright, walking like a person, had it have turned and faced me, and what kind of face did it have? I didn't know. Whether it was a monkey-type face or whether it was going to be a human-type face. So I think that would have been just too shocking, on top of being a large-bodied biped. So I was quite happy I didn't see the face. Now I wish I had, because that sighting at that distance was never repeated for me.
When you read about the Orang Pendek, a lot of people's responses is that it's a misidentified orangutan or gibbon. Can you respond to those explanations?
Yeah, I fully understand. It's like, it's the Occam's razor thing, the paucity of explanation. If you have a landscape with that has one large-bodied primate, then when people claim to see a large-bodied primate, it's more likely to be orangutan than something new. But I have been a naturalist really my whole life. I know very clearly the difference between an orangutan, a gorilla, a chimpanzee. This is something that was very, very different. And the interesting thing, there was a paper written by a couple of quite prominent researchers, orangutan researchers, that claimed that it was an orangutan, or it is an orangutan. The footprints that we found were the handprints of an orangutan. But the interesting thing is these researchers didn't come and talk to us about our sightings. And this is what I've often found, is that most people are sceptical, and they come with that baggage of not wanting to believe and not really wanting to be disproved. But if someone honestly sits down and listens to what we have to say, or goes to Sumatra and listens to what local people have to say, then I think they generally come away believing that there's something to the story.
It must be incredibly frustrating to see something that shocking, and yet the rest of the world doesn't take the creature seriously. Have you taken any steps since seeing it to push forward research or credibility in it?
Well, yes, I've spent the rest of my life since 1994 doing exactly that. Debbie and I were extremely lucky in the fact that we both had a sighting. We were both absolutely convinced of what we'd seen, and I think my passion and the description I could give was quite convincing at the time. It's maybe tarnished over the years, but at that time, I really thought we'd kind of cracked it. Debbie had seen it in one mountain, I'd seen it in another mountain. It clearly, there were more than one, well, obviously there was more than one animal, but we'd gone to two different locations and we'd managed to see it. And my feeling was that people had never seen it because they'd never bothered to look. And the fact that we'd looked, we had cracked it, we knew how to find it. So we went back to UK and we were extremely lucky, and we had two quite august institutions listened to the story, believed us and supported us. And one of those was Fauna and Flora International, and the other one was the Natural History Unit, the BBC Natural History Unit. They both came on board to support a return trip, which is what we did. We went back in 1995 and tried to get some physical evidence for the animal. We had a project supported by Fauna and Flora International for 3 years. So Debbie and I stayed in Sumatra for those 3 years. During that period, we diversified the work we were doing to cover a lot more things in the national park, and I ended up staying there for 11 years, and Debbie never left, really, although the focus of her work has become Sumatran tigers, not Orang Pendek. But I've continued as much as I can. So with camera trapping programs, I still, in fact, I'm just waiting to go to Sumatra now. So I've continued the search. It's not frustrating to me that people don't believe, because I don't have any doubt myself, and I really, when I meet people that adamantly don't believe, it actually gives me a little bit of a thrill to think that I have seen something that is unbelievable. There's no other animal you can really say that about. If I saw a blue whale or a snow leopard or a giant panda, they're all things you can pay on a tour to go and see. But with this one, you can't. So that does give me a great sense of personal pride, even though a lot of people don't believe it. The great frustration is not a personal one for me. It's a frustration for the animal. While no one believes in it, then we can't do anything to try and protect it. And that was the reason that I continued to look for it, was not to validate it for other people, because to be honest, I really didn't care too much about that, my own personal point of view. But I did think this would be a fantastic tool for us to push for the conservation of the rainforest. So often you hear people saying, don't destroy the rainforest because we don't know what's in it. And I thought, they're usually referring to frogs or maybe the next cure for cancer. But when it's something that, in a sense, is closer to human beings than any other creature, not necessarily genetically, but just in the fact of its morphology, that it's a biped, then what else could not be in the rainforest if it can hide something like that until the last years of the 20th century? And that's my frustration, is that we've lost an opportunity, I think, to the tool for protecting the rainforest.
If the Orang Pendek is real, there's just something kind of tragic about the animal. This creature could potentially disappear before we even knew it existed, which is a kind of a horrifying thought, given that the most human-like creature on the planet.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned earlier the first thought that came to your mind was Australopithecus, but that later changed. What did that change to, or are you still unsure of what you saw?
I'm not unsure of what I saw, but the thing is, in biology, morphology doesn't really mean very much. So you can't necessarily look at something and think, because it's that shape, it's this. I personally don't think it's related to orangutan. So what used to be the Pongi Day, that's now changed now, but that was at the time, that was the family that included gorilla, chimpanzee, and orangutan. And I've since been lucky enough to see chimpanzees in the wild and orangutans in the wild. This is something very, very, very different. And I mean, interestingly, we were working with one Indonesian researcher who was very, very adamant that it was an orangutan. And at the time, in the 90s, the 500 rupee note in Indonesia had a picture of an orangutan on the back of it. And we were out one day interviewing a local that had seen Orang Pendek, and my Indonesian counterpart was pushing him to admit that it was an orangutan. And the guy got so frustrated, and eventually my friend took out the 500 rupee note and said, "Look, it didn't look anything like this." And out of utter frustration, the witness said a line that I've said many, many times myself. "Yes, it has a head. Yes, it has arms. Yes, it has legs. That's the only way in which it looks like an orangutan." So it's a very, very different creature.
You mentioned earlier that you still have plans looking for the creature. What are your future plans, and what do you plan to do to capture evidence of the creature?
Well, as a photographer, I was always hoping to get, and I specialised in camera traps. That's what my working life has really been since I first started using those. The Natural History Unit, BBC Natural History Unit, built me some units in the mid-90s. But now, of course, thanks to American hunters, there's a whole slew of different off-the-shelf cameras you can buy. So I've specialised really going around Asia, photographing a lot of things that had never been photographed before. And Orang Pendek is really my huge failure in that regard, as I've spent a lot of time camera trapping in Sumatra. I've got some very rare things, a lot of pictures of things for the first time, but I've missed getting Orang Pendek. So as a photographer, I would like to get photographic evidence. But things have also changed greatly. When I first started doing this, there was no digital. Now there is. It's possible to fake stuff. So even if you had brilliant footage, it wouldn't necessarily convince everybody. And like every new discovery, you end up having to have some kind of physical evidence. But that's very difficult because of the rules in Indonesia now about removing anything to do with DNA or any physical material. You have to have research status to be able to do that, and that's extremely difficult to get, and more so with the new rules that have just come out in Indonesia. So really, I'm left with the photographic option, which wouldn't clear up the debate. It would be some evidence, but it wouldn't necessarily be 100% proof.
I know there was a surged interest in the creature after the discovery of Homo floresiensis.
Yes.
People thought there might be a connection between Orang Pendek and floresiensis. Do you think there's any merit to this idea?
No. To my mind, there's absolutely no relationship to those two. I did go down, directly after that discovery, I went down to Flores to just take a look for myself. And then I worked on a documentary with a British crew, and I interviewed some people that claimed to have seen these things in Flores, and they were very convincing, I must admit. I have trouble believing that they could have survived that long. But what they described was clearly very, very different. Homo floresiensis is obviously a type of human. Orang Pendek isn't. That's a great ape. So I don't think there's any relationship with them at all. It's just a coincidence that two smallish bipedal creatures were discovered in Indonesia.
Other than footprints, is there any other compelling physical evidence that you know of?
When Debbie had her sighting, we collected a couple of hairs. The animal that she saw stepped over a fallen log, and on that log we managed to collect some hairs. So that was back in 1994, and at the time it was about $13,000 to get a hair analysed for DNA. At that time also, if the hair didn't have a medulla, so it didn't have any skin attached to the end of it, then you couldn't extract DNA from it. So the two hairs we collected at that time, they did go for analysis, and nothing was found. If we had those same samples now, it would be very different. We collected hair in 1997 also from some feces that we found. I had to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and I collected the same kind of hairs, long, wavy, yellowish hair. That was also went for analysis at great cost. But again, no medulla, so no result. Adam Davis also, I believe, collected some hairs. I remember he showed me a footprint once that had a hair embedded in it. And I think they went for shaft analysis, which was actually a better thing to do in the absence of a medulla. And that showed that they were nothing that was known to be in the Sumatran rainforest. But other than that, I mean, it's a shocking paucity of any physical evidence. We have no bones. We have footprints, but really they're kind of almost valueless in terms of proof, because they're very easy to fake. They can give us an idea of the morphology of the Orang Pendek foot, which is seems to be quite different from a human foot. But in terms of evidence, they're nothing more than a curiosity. So the answer is no. In all this time we've spent, we really don't have very much to show for it, unfortunately.
Could you recount Debbie's experience in more detail?
I bumped into her while she was looking to this, and she invited me along on one of her field trips. And she had a very, very good tracker. And we just seemed to be, every day going out, he was finding footprints, we were following them. So I suggested that maybe it would be better if we did find some, or thought an animal was near, we'd split up and did a kind of a pincer movement, because I thought following it we could do this for the rest of our lives. It's obviously going to be very aware of us in the forest, and there's not much chance of us ever seeing it. So the very next day she said, okay, let's do that. We left camp as usual at 6 o'clock in the morning, and within an hour we'd located what the guide said was an Orang Pendek. It was being mobbed by monkeys. So we sent him round to try and get behind where the monkeys were, and Debbie and I sat really any way we could do a pincer movement, because the terrain was not very friendly. But we just sat on a jungle slope. I was sitting, maybe 3 meters, 4 meters from Debbie. And at the time I was very sceptical, and I honestly didn't believe there was anything to this story. But suddenly Debbie said, "Oh shit," and burst into tears. And it took a while for her to actually be able to tell me that she had just seen this animal walk across the opposite slope. That was quite dense jungle, but we had a clear view of the opposite slope. So she had a similar view to what I had. You never see anything for very long in the forest because it's too dense. But there was a clearing where there was a fallen log, which she saw it step over. The animal she saw was smaller than the one I saw, and slightly different colour. It was a reddish goldy colour. But again, a biped, hair covered. It didn't make any noise. But a biped moving quietly and smoothly.
You spent a lot of time in the rainforests of Indonesia. Could you talk a bit about some of the dangers deforestation is posing to wildlife there, Orang Pendek included?
Yes, well, I've now been going to Sumatra for 25 years, so of course I've seen horrific changes in the amount of forest. Basically, a protected area there, it doesn't mean the same thing it does in the West. a protected area is really a free-for-all for anybody that wants to, especially in Indonesia now. They have a quite a strong belief in human rights, so the government actually discourages prosecution of anybody that's making farmland. So it's a gradual kind of termite nibbling away of the forest edge. And it's the park we were working in, where we both saw Orang Pendek, which is a black national park. And it's a huge national park, but it has a border of something like 2,500 kilometers. So, of course, every part of that is being eroded by illegal farms. And the valleys, incursions up into the valleys, so you get these increasing areas of forest which become islands. And it's something like Orang Pendek, which is, it doesn't seem to have a set range. It's moving around all the time. So as forest gets isolated and becomes, smaller and smaller islands, then obviously it's no longer acceptable habitat for animals like that. Obviously, there's going to be a decreasing population. It's harder for animals to move between areas, to meet. How they actually meet and mate, we don't have a clue. But clearly, when forest is becoming fragmented, this becomes more of a challenge.
What are some of the steps people can take to help slow down deforestation and preserve some of that natural environment?
This is a good question that many people have tried to solve and have failed. I mean, there's been huge amount of money spent on development projects in Kerinci to try and give people an alternative livelihood. But you have the problem of huge population growth in Indonesia. I think it was something like 190 million when I first went there, and now it's 280 million, something like this. So that's something, all these people, like all these land, most people in Sumatra, rural Sumatra, they will have a small farm which is carved out to the forest. Before the national parks were created, this wasn't a problem. People were just taking part of what was very, very abundant forest. Now, with so many people, so much clearance, and also clearance not just for personal use, but to sell. So some people make a living clearing forest and selling it to people that live in the town. And then those people will pay farmers to look after it. So it's a huge stress. And unless you have the political will in Indonesia to protect these areas, which unfortunately you don't, because any government that started enforcing protection of forest would not be voted in, basically. So it's a very dire prognosis for the future of Sumatran rainforest, unfortunately.
We're running short on time, but I am really interested in hearing about your recent experiences in India. What was this creature you were looking for, and how did you learn about it?
Yes, well, this was something northeast India. I've worked a lot in most areas of Southeast Asia, and there's Orang Pendek is one of the creatures, one of these bipedal creatures that's described from Southeast Asia. But there's a whole bunch of others. I mean, the Yeti in Bhutan and Nepal and China. There's similar stories from Myanmar and Assam. But there was one particular area of northeast India called Meghalaya, which is it was closed for a long, long time because of rebel activity. The area wasn't safe. I went there maybe 30 years ago. I got special permission to go from the Indian government, and I had a brief trip there. But there's an animal there called Mandai Burung, which translates as forest man. So I wanted to go and have a look and see if there was any reality to those stories. So I just spent a month travelling around in western Meghalaya, interviewing local people that claim to have seen the animal. It's clearly, I was interested to see if it had any relationship to Orang Pendek, which it clearly doesn't. What the people are describing there is much, much bigger. 8 to 9 feet tall, black coloured, black skin, black hair, huge feet of 14 and a half inches long. And it's more similar to the North American Bigfoot in description. But I had some quite convincing stories from local people, but I didn't see any evidence myself.
Have you looked anywhere else in the world for other Orang Pendek-like creatures? I mean, the idea of a bipedal ape is a common story across the world. No,
I mean, the thing is, it's very difficult to do, and like I said, I do actually remain very, very sceptical about most of these things. I mean, I can't be sceptical about Orang Pendek because I saw it. But I speak fluent Indonesian. I know the area very well, and I know that I'm not wasting my time on a wild goose chase because there's an animal there. The place in India, I'm not so sure. I don't speak the language, so it becomes very, very difficult. It's hard enough in Sumatra. So doing it somewhere else, it could become tantamount to impossible. So I've tried to utilise the funds I have and the time I have to try and crack the Orang Pendek case rather than get diverted on trying to follow up things which I'm not certain exist.
Do you believe the Orang Pendek could be a real creature? Let us know on our Twitter and Instagram at @strange_phenom and on Facebook at Strange Phenomenon, all one word. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. Visit www.strange-phenomenon.com for a full list of sources and more episodes. Strange Phenomenon is hosted by Ray Tarara. It's written and produced by RJ Blake and Ray Tarara. Theme music by Tara Monk. Additional music provided by Sergei Cheremizanov.